Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Richard Ebeling for this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Great to be back with y'all. As many of you know, we have a new project at FFF called our ebook series, where we're publishing books in ebook format. And we have had a lot of success with the earlier books we did, and we recently published a fantastic book on gun rights by Scott McPherson, who's been writing for us for many years, called Freedom and Security. If you haven't bought it, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best books on gun rights I've ever read. And our very next ebook that's almost ready to publish is called Monetary Central Planning and the State, authored by none other than the co-host of the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling. So welcome to the show, Richard.
It's good to be with you, as always.
Yeah. So I thought we would discuss, since we're going to be celebrating the publication of this book, I'm sure we'll be talking about more about it, but talk about inflation, monetary central planning, the Federal Reserve, talk about some of the basic principles here. You know, one of the things that is always struck me as compared to the time when we were growing up in the 50s and 60s is the coinage in America. That when we were growing up, we had silver quarters and silver dimes, and we were just accustomed to silver coins as just part of our basic coinage. And at some point, all of a sudden, those coins started disappearing from circulation. We ended up with these alloyed coins that had no silver in them at all. And people always sort of took the position that this was sort of an inevitable process. They would talk about the olden days when silver was part of the coins, and that, you just got the sense that their logic was, well, this is the price of progress. This is what happens when a nation starts getting prosperous, that it ends up with these alloyed coins and of course, paper money too. I mean, there's no more gold dollars or silver dollars to circulate. And of course, as you and I know, this is all a product of the federal government, and specifically the Federal Reserve and the inflationary policies they've had decade after decade after decade, that it doesn't have anything to do with, oh, this is a natural progression in history, or this is a price of progress. This has everything to do with monetary debasement. What do you think, Richard?
Well, you're absolutely right. If we can just sort of start at the beginning, the fact is that money is not the creation or the invention of government. Money emerged out of the spontaneous interactions of people in the marketplace themselves, attempting to overcome the difficulties and hurdles of barter, the direct trading of one good for another. You have something I want, but I don't have something that you want. Clearly, the trade is not going to occur. Or we each have something that the other wants, but we can't agree upon the terms of trade. How many of X to be traded for Y? Well, if to divide Y into some tradable form reflecting the agreed upon trade or terms of exchange diminishes the quality or characteristics that makes Y attractive, then the trade is not going to occur. If I offer you several baskets of fish for your horse, and you say those baskets of fish are only worth half a horse, and I need a horse to either pull a plow or pull a wagon, and half a horse is not going to work. Of course, I might hesitate a minute. Is that the front half, the back half, the left side, right? But you want a whole horse. So the indivisibility of a product, without it losing its characteristics, its desirable characteristics, can prohibit an exchange as well. So over thousands of years, looking at human history as a whole, the fact is people started looking for and using commodities that they found were in wide and high demand, were generally durable, and therefore could be held aside to be used for trading purposes when it was convenient. That was relatively easily transported around and divisible to reflect the agreed upon terms of trade. And historically, the commodities that, whether in Europe or Asia or Africa or anywhere, the commodities that were found to have those qualities and characteristics most valuable and useful for that purpose were traditionally gold and silver. Now, in the more modern era, by which I mean looking, let's say, over the last 500 years or so, it was found that it's not always convenient to carry gold or silver coin or bullion, the bars. It is inconvenient, it's heavy, it's awkward, and it's easily open to the temptations of thieves and robbers. So people started putting their gold and silver for safekeeping with a goldsmith or a silversmith. And he basically saw a side business as serving as a depository for this purposes. And he would issue receipts. Of course, I'm making a generalization that historically evolved in slightly different nuanced ways. But in general, what happened is the gold or silversmith would hold your gold and silver for safekeeping. He would issue a receipt, which was the claim against that which was your property. And people started using these claims in exchange, rather than having to go to him every time to withdraw gold and silver, then make a purchase, and if they got gold and silver, redeposit it. So the receipts to the gold and silver, to the extent that the goldsmith or the blacksmith had a high and reliable and dependable reputation among the people of a community, started using these receipts as a money substitute. And you would just transfer the claim to the gold and silver rather than the inconvenience of having to withdraw the gold and silver for every transaction. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In a sense, you're saying that the claim is as, quote, as good as gold, a money substitute. But of course, again, making a broad stroke summary, Jacob, that obviously is a little different in different countries. But the fact is that governments would at some point would go to these goldsmiths, silversmiths, who themselves are taking on the characteristic and quality of being a banking depository, and they would borrow. And what they would be lent in is not necessarily gold and silver, but these receipts, these bank notes. And what happened is that if we take the case, if I can use one example, the Bank of England, back in the 1600s, the British government was fighting wars. And you need money to fight wars. So the British government went to the Bank of England, which was at that time just a private bank, like the Bank of America is a private bank, and arranged loans for war purposes. But they kept borrowing more and more of these notes, and the bank was getting concerned about its solvency. So the British government went to the Bank of England and said, tell you what I'm going to do. We're going to give you a deal, okay? And this deal is we're going to give you a monopoly over the issuance of notes throughout Great Britain. Now, what does that mean? What it meant was that before that, each bank was more or less issuing its own notes. The Hornberger, the $5 banknote from the Hornberger First National Bank, and so on. Now, the Bank of England was offered a monopoly. Every bank that received gold and silver deposits from its depositors would have to issue them as a claim against the gold and silver, a Bank of England note rather than their own. Well, then all these Bank of England notes have to be bought by the other banks from the Bank of England. This is a great boon, profit, right? You're the only banknote supplier in town. And that became the basis of governments giving a monopoly to one bank and giving it this centralized monopoly position. And then that bank being expected to constantly fund the government. And again, just to continue with this historical example as a representation. So again, the viewers may remember that shortly after the French Revolution of 1789, revolutionary France ended up in wars with many of its neighbors, including Great Britain. Wars that went on with first revolutionary France and then Napoleon's France when he became emperor and then dictator. Went on for 25 years. And in around 1793, if I remember, 1797, the Bank of England had been issuing so many notes to fund the government's war expenditures, and people were bringing so many notes back to the bank to claim the gold that the notes were supposed to represent, that the bank was fearful that it was going to run out of gold before it had paid off all the notes that it had printed up that were returning for redemption. So in the 1790s, the British government passed what was called the Restriction Act. And they said, now you can't claim gold or silver for the notes anymore. Now you just have to accept the paper money. And that continued throughout the Napoleonic War. Now, when the wars ended in 1815, the British government started getting its financial houses in order. It actually ran budget surpluses, paid back all the notes through surpluses that it had borrowed from the Bank of England to fund those wars with France. And so finally, at around 1783, the notes had contracted into sufficient numbers that now the Bank of England could be required by an act of Parliament to reissue redemption, that is, to establish redemption. You have a note, you go to the Bank of England, and that note represents a certain fixed, guaranteed during business hour quantity of gold. And that continued from around 1823 until 1914, the beginning of the First World War. So Britain had almost a century, certainly 90 years, of a gold standard, with just a few instances of a bank panic where it was halted for brief periods of time. That assured monetary stability, no inflation, a sound investment climate. And this gold-backed monetary system was in the setting of a liberal agenda. And of course, many listeners will know when we use the word liberal, we mean it in the old classical liberal sense of individual freedom, private property, free enterprise, and limited constitutional government. That was the setting. All that changed with the First World War, because first Britain and France and Imperial Germany and Imperial Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy, all on the different sides of the First World War, went off their gold standards because they were going to have to print money to fund their respective war efforts, because they were fearful of going to their respective citizens and saying, war costs money, we're going to directly tax you. And that broke the gold standard, and it has never been really returned to. There were half-hearted attempts to return to the gold standard in the years immediately after the First World War. But they were only half-hearted, so governments can continue to have degrees of control over the printing press. And then, of course, that just resulted in the total abolition and abandonment of the gold standard with the coming of the Great Depression, when the new ideal, led by Keynesians and other interventionists, no, government shouldn't be bound by shackles of gold. It should have the authority, discretion, and ability to print as much money as it needs to fund full employment, a growing economy, stimulus for industry, and that has continued the basis. So to the extent that one views, somehow a paper money as a modern system, it really is a throwback to an earlier era before classical liberalism, where government wanted arbitrary and capricious and complete control to manage and control and manipulate the economic affairs of the society. Paper money is, in fact, a symbol of absolute government wanting absolute authority to influence all of our market and commercial lives, to fund its own expenses, and to manipulate markets. The gold standard was a symbol of shackles on government, limits on government and its central bank from being able to just flood the market, make it awash with paper money, and destroy the value of people's currency by price inflation. So paper money is a throwback to the past. Gold is a symbol of sound economics.
Yeah, the inflationary aspects of all this is really, as you point out, a way to plunder and loot people. That politicians, the only way government gets its money is by taxing or borrowing. And if it borrows, it has to tax to pay back the debt. But as you point out, politicians get reluctant to tax people. People don't like paying ever-increasing taxes. So inflation provides the perfect means by which to plunder and loot people, because the politician can then say, we don't know why prices are rising. We have no idea. And they start blaming it on the greedy, profit-seeking businessman running the filling station, the service station on the corner, raising gas prices. It's all his fault. Now, before paper money was invented, or paper, the printing press was invented, there was certainly ways to plunder people. They remember they would shave the edges of the coins when people would pay their taxes with, say, private coins. And they would come into the coffers of the state, and the king would just shave the edges, or in the most flagrant cases, punch a hole into the coin where there'd be a little hole there, and he would take the plug and then melt down the shavings and the plugs and produce new coins that the king could spend. And it was his way of plundering and looting people indirectly. And then as people started questioning the validity of what previously was a 1-ounce gold coin, they would start passing these legal tender laws. And in essence, that's really the history of the United States, isn't it, Richard? We come into the, when the Constitution calls the federal government into existence, the official money of the American people is gold coins, silver coins. Everybody understood that there were paper notes, but these were notes. They were promissory notes. They were notes promising to pay money, which was the gold. So everybody understood it wasn't a gold-backed paper money. The gold standard was the fact that gold coins and silver coins and copper coins were the official money of the realm. And gradually, and that system lasted 100 years, more than 100 years. The only exception was during the Civil War when Lincoln started printing an excess number of notes and enacts legal tender laws, forcing people to accept them. But after the war, it goes back to gold is the money, silver is the money, all the way up to the establishment of the Federal Reserve in, 1913?
1913.
1913, and then all of a sudden, there come, as you point out in your series, Monetary Central Planning in the State, in this new ebook, the decades of inflation, where gradually Gresham's law comes about, drives the good money, the silver coins, the gold coins, out of circulation, even though today they're still official legal tender, but nobody dares to use them. Why should you put a silver quarter into a vending machine when you can use a debased alloyed quarter that's worth significantly less? So, yeah, good money drives out the bad money. I mean, bad money drives out the good money.
One of the reasons why Americans, at the time of the founding of the Constitution, were so sympathetic to and actively in support of what they called hard currency monies, that is gold and silver, is the fact is that a good part of the Revolutionary War was funded through paper money. The 13 colonies had come together in a consort of a Continental Congress. George Washington, with his ramshackle army to fight the British, needed war material, food to feed the troops, clothing to make the uniforms, and so on. And the colonies were reluctant and sometimes didn't have the ability to tax their own colonial subjects and citizens to subsidize the war's expenses. So what they did, they passed a resolution to start issuing what became known as continental notes. These were promissory notes that you accept one of these continental notes, and when we win the American Revolution, we, the Continental Congress, representing what will then be the free citizens of the 13 states, will then tax our citizens to be able to pay you the gold and silver that it represents. Now, the problem with this is that, first of all, people were reluctant, right? These 13 colonies, in which not everyone supports the revolution, is fighting the biggest power in the world then, the British Empire. Fat chance you're going to win. We're going to be stuck with these notes. So they passed mandatory requirements that when Washington's representatives came out to the countryside and demanded that you sell them food or other material for the Revolutionary Army, you were compelled to take these continental notes. And then the Continental Congress realized that one shot of these notes were not going to cover all the costs of fighting the British. So they gave themselves authority for another issuance and another issuance. The result was there was a huge Continental Congress paper money inflation. What was the response then of the Continental Congress and some of the independent state governments? Wage and price controls, Jacob. Wage and price controls. That, of course, caused distortions between supply and demand. People would be arrested and threatened with being hanged in a public place for violation of either what were then the legal tender accepting these or violation of the wage and price controls. The two men were taken to a public square in Albany, New York, put on a scaffold, the noose was put around their neck, and they promised on their knees that they would never charge a price above the legal price, and they would always accept continental notes. Please don't hang me. And they were let go, but as a lesson to others. Now, that experience with paper money inflation, being forced to accept the paper money, the negative effect of wage and price controls as the paper money caused depreciation and rising prices, all created a psychological and cultural atmosphere that was very conducive that when it came time to promulgate the Constitution and implement it, people wanted nothing more to do with it. Or as the phrase was for many decades after the American Revolution, when you talked about a paper money, not worth a continental, not worth a continental, a totally worthless piece of paper printed up by a government.
Yeah, and we've seen historical examples of that time and time again in Zimbabwe, where they had like $1 trillion notes or whatever the currency was there, or in Germany during the hyperinflation where people are carrying wheelbarrows of paper money to buy a loaf of bread into a store. But let's talk about the Great Depression. You know, you and I grew up in an era where we were inculcated with the notion, as kids are today, that the Great Depression was the failure of free enterprise. That it just showed you that America's free enterprise system, as good as it just isn't perfect. It produces these booms and busts and recessions and bubbles and Great Depression and boy, we just need the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal to fix it, which involved, by the way, a confiscation of everybody's gold coins. I mean, it was made a felony. This is still so shocking to me that the federal government actually nationalized what had been the official money of the American people for 125 years, the official money of the Constitution. I mean, there's provisions in there that say no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin legal tender. And as you and I know that we've learned from Murray Rothbard, from Hans Sennholz, from the Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian school, all of that is pure lies, bunk, and deception. That the cause of the Great Depression was this monetary central planning, the Federal Reserve System that had come in 1913, and that's really the cause of these booms and busts. Am I right, Richard?
Absolutely. The Federal Reserve was promulgated by an act of Congress, chartered as a private corporation by Congress in 1913. They opened their doors in January of 1914. And that was also the year, in August of 1914, that saw the beginning of the First World War. America did not enter the war until April of 1917. And therefore, the U.S. participated in approximately the last year and a half of the First World War, the war ending with the famous armistice on November 11th, 1918. But even for that 1 year and a half, the Federal Reserve, now having this new established authority to control the national money supply and to be able to print up this newfangled thing called Federal Reserve notes, proceeded to do so and funded a large portion of the government's war expenditures, even for that last year and a half of the First World War, causing a huge inflation here that was then followed by a sharp but soonly recovered recession, a post-war depression. But then in about 1921, 1922, the Federal Reserve began a grand experiment. We're going to micromanage the money supply of the country to prevent either price inflation, rising prices, or price deflation, falling prices. The idea being is that an indicator, a symbol of a stabilized economy is stable prices, right? A stable price level of goods and services as measured by a wholesale price index, a consumer price index. And in general, that is the policy they followed between 1922 until 1929. Everybody thought, well, look here, this is America's high-tech revolution, right? The automobile, electricity, the introduction of supermarkets, the vacuum cleaner, that was the high-tech, the telephone. This was the high-tech era. And it's all been done with growing prosperity, rising standards of living, and stable prices. Happy days are here again. We're on a path of continual growth with no problems. But then in 1929, the stock market broke in October, which then began sort of as the stone that begins the snowball of the entire downturn of the economy until finally in 1933, the economy reached bottom. As measured by the government statistics, 25% of the workforce unemployed. The price level having collapsed by 1/3. Industrial production down by about 50%. Agricultural production down about 40%. Real goods and services, trade among nations, collapsed by half compared to 1929. This was a catastrophe. But why had this come about, Bumper? Why had this happened? Well, basically because beneath the supposed illusion of a stable price level in the 1920s, micromanaged by Federal Reserve policy through the banking system, beneath the surface, there had been this America's high-tech revolution of the 1920s. More goods and services, new cost-efficient technologies, falling manufacturing expenses, all of which is if the Federal Reserve had not managed the money supply, would have brought about a gently falling price level as first one good and another good became less expensive for consumers to buy. And businessmen not necessarily suffering losses at lower prices because you innovate with lower costs precisely so you can sell at a lower price given the consumer demand and still make a profit. So we would have had gently falling prices, a gently falling price deflation with rising prosperity. But what the Fed did was to pump money into the economy and keep prices higher than they otherwise would have been set by the market. And they did so through pumping money into the banking system, pushing interest rates below their market levels. And by doing this, bringing about a distortion between savings and investment, an excessive and misdirected investment boom, a housing boom, a construction boom, a stock market boom, and all of this came crashing down in 1929. So the Great Depression was caused by monetary mismanagement by the Federal Reserve throughout the 1920s. And then, of course, the question is, why did it become so bad? We've gone through booms and busts before. Like I said, even in the immediate post-World War I era, the U.S. economy went through what economists call a V-shaped recession. Steep, but a rapid recovery. Why did this go on for so long throughout most of the 1930s? Basically because governments did not do what they often had done in the past, keep their hands off the economy. They usually kept their hands off so markets could readjust themselves to the post-boom reality. Prices adjusting, wages adjusting, resource uses adjusting to the new non-inflationary, non-boom environment. But beginning immediately with a Republican president, Hoover, and then exacerbated with the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt, the policies followed by both of these presidents, and they were the equivalents in Europe, was to introduce budget deficits, raising taxes, trying to jawbone first with Herbert Hoover, business and labor, not to allow prices and wages to adjust to post-boom market clearing levels. And that just resulted in the snowball of a collapsing economy. Then Franklin Roosevelt comes in, running, by the way, on a Democratic Party platform in 1932 that called for less government, lower taxes, balanced budgets, and respect for states' rights versus federal intrusion. Of course, when he came into office in early 1933, he instituted policies the exact opposite of that. As you said, not too long afterwards, he took the United States off the gold standard with the threat of confiscation and imprisonment if you didn't turn in your gold coin and bullion for Federal Reserve banknotes. He also introduced a system of fascist-type economic controls and regulations over the economy, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Recovery Administration, that put a fascist stranglehold on the economy. And that exacerbated the imbalances and distortions carrying over from the Great Depression. So the economy went through most of the 1930s without the ability to recover from the disaster of Federal Reserve policy from earlier years. And that's why it happened and why it was so deep and prolonged.
All right. Well, when you talk about this disastrous mismanagement, it really brings us right back to the title of your book, this new ebook that we're publishing, Monetary Central Planning in the State, that it really is central planning. I mean, that central planning is this concept that comes about through what we normally know as socialism. We know that central planning caused chaos and crises in the Soviet Union, everywhere where socialism has been. Why would we be surprised that monetary central planning would produce the same types of crises and chaos, Richard?
Absolutely none. You've hit the nail on the head. The fact is that the reason why it appropriately is called monetary central planning is that it is merely a variation on the general conception of government planning of economic affairs. The presumption that a handful of individuals who have the knowledge, ability, and wisdom to successfully plan a complex and intricate economy from the center through their own limited mental and intellectual abilities. Now, as you just said, we saw this in the Soviet Union. We saw it in China under Mao, in Cuba under the Castros, and so on. Today, even in North Korea with Kim Il-sung and his wacko regime. What does it lead to? Not economic prosperity, not a horn of plenty, not a balanced economy, but what the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises entitled one of his later little books, Planned Chaos. Now, if this is the case, why should we expect much of a difference in terms of result or outcome when we give a monopoly control over the money supply to a handful of board of governors of the Federal Reserve who are just human beings like you and me with limited knowledge, limited ability, limited wisdom, who arrogantly, with great hubris, presume that they know what the quantity of money should be in the economy. And through that manipulation of the quantity of money, what the value or purchasing power of the money in our pocket should be. That they, through being able to inject money into the banking system, know what interest rates should be, as opposed to markets determining through competitive interaction, through savings and investors, what the equilibrium or clearing and balancing rate of interest should be. That is the arrogance and hubris. And while they keep saying, well, you know, we've made mistakes and we had bad timing in the past, don't worry, next time we'll get it right. There is no next time. It is institutionally impossible for a handful of people, even with a large staff of professional economists playing with all the little mathematical models, it is impossible for them to know better than leaving the market to its own, which means leaving individuals alone, using their own knowledge, judgments, and abilities to interact with their neighbors, including in financial markets setting interest rates and in the market for determining what shall be used as money, in assuring a balance and a coordination and a growth of what free people are attempting to do in their economic affairs. Handing it over to government or a central bank is institutionally, inherently putting into the hands of a system that will result in nothing more and nothing less than a continuing pattern of the booms and busts that we've experienced in the past and will now see again in the future.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised what the alternative is. I mean, you're really describing Hayek's concept of the fatal conceit, that people really have, the central planners have this conceit that with the right people and the right computers or the right equipment, they can plan the monetary decisions of millions of people. It simply cannot be done. It produces planned chaos. But what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is freedom in the free market or libertarianism. You dismantle the Fed, you get rid of it. You dismantle legal tender laws. You separate money in the state, where the free market is back in action, where people are deciding for themselves what the medium of exchange is going to be. That may be gold coins, silver coins that start surfacing in the marketplace. It may be Bitcoins. It may be anything. You just don't know. But what we do know is that is the most efficient and the most moral solution. Let the market operate, which is essentially say, let free people operate.
Absolutely.
Now, let me ask you this. Let's wrap up with some books that we might recommend to people. One of the best books I ever read in this area was by Hans Sennholz. He was an Austrian economist, got his doctorate under Mises, taught at Grove City College, served as president of the Foundation for Economic Education, same institution where you served as president for many years. He had this great little book called Money and Freedom that I learned so much from. I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure you can still get it online. It may even be free online. Then there's Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? That just had a big influence on me. What do you think? Do you have any particular books that you would recommend in this area?
Yes, I think that another good one, it's several years old, but we're talking about fundamental underlying principles. And that it was a book by Henry Hazlitt called The Inflation Crisis and How to Resolve It, in which he clearly, in the standard, if any viewers have read Hazlitt's Economics 1 lesson, they know what a fine and lucid and concise writer he was. And he has this book called The Inflation Crisis and How to Resolve It, in which he explains the causes and the history of inflation and the gold-back market solutions to it. I would also just recommend, of course, just generally, more serious books, not as short or as perhaps as easy to read, but certainly Ludwig von Mises' Theory of Money and Credit, Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression. So if anyone who began with those books, the ones you've named and that I've added to just now, you'd be a long way under having a solid knowledge and background and the intellectual ammunition to make the case for a non-inflationary environment in which money is separated from the state.
Yeah, my hunch is that if the college student were to read those particular books, he'd know more about monetary policy than most of the college professors in the country teaching economics. Anyway, on that note, Richard, we've run out of time. Great to have you again, and congratulations on your impending ebook that's coming out, Monetary Central Planning in the State. We should have it out within probably a week to two. And so it's great to have that, and greatly enjoyed the show today again.
Thank you. See you next time.
All right. See you next week. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week.